In the dim belly of Toledo's Grand Cathedral in 1568, a place meant to echo hymns and devotion, a different kind of ritual unfolded. A woman named Elvira del Campo was bound to a rigid wooden chair by men who claimed to defend purity and truth. They pushed a cold metallic instrument between her teeth, a strange, jointed device that opened wider each time a screw clicked forward. 1 click, 2, 3. Her jaw was stretched until the pain blurred into something indescribable. For 6 relentless hours, they manipulated that device. Yet when they finally unstrapped her, there were no broken bones, no bloodied wounds, just a woman whose voice would never again form a steady sentence, and a confession the church could proudly claim was freely given. But the real horror, this wasn't an anomaly. It was a calculated masterpiece. What you're about to hear isn't simply a tale of medieval cruelty. It's a story of a 356-year system, an institution so efficient at hiding its brutality that even modern textbooks treat it like a foggy legend. And it's the story of why women, specifically, became the favorite quarry of one of the most powerful religious courts in the world. By the time we reach the end of this narrative, you'll understand why historians quietly tiptoe around these events, why nearly 70% of Inquisition victims were female, and why that number wasn't the result of superstition or spiritual paranoia. It was strategy. Cold, mathematical strategy. Here's what these hidden archives reveal. First, there was an economic engine behind the terror, a machine that transformed wealthy widows into disposable, high-value targets. Second, there existed torture devices crafted exclusively for women's bodies, tools deliberately scrubbed from public records to keep the institution looking holy, clean, and merciful. And third, these invisible tortures allow the Inquisition to posture as moral guardians while quietly erasing entire bloodlines from Spanish society. If that sounds abstract, wait a moment, because once you recognize this pattern, you'll start seeing it reflected in modern policies, engendered laws, and political rhetoric. Patterns have a way of surviving. But let's not jump ahead. To understand why women were singled out, we must rewind to the birth of this machinery. Spain, 1478. Ferdinand and Isabella, names you probably remember from school books, established what we now call the Spanish Inquisition. The official story painted the institution as a guardian of faith, hunting heretics and protecting the realm from dangerous religious deviations. But that was just the mask. Behind it lurked the system obsessed with control, over land, over wealth, over reputation, and women, especially women who possessed influence, education, or autonomy, were easy marks. Here's a statistic almost no mass-market history book prints. In a massive analysis of 44,000 Inquisition trials, historians Gustav Hennington and Jaime Contreras found that between 60 and 70% of those accused were women. Think about the absurdity of that. In a society where men dominated religious positions, legal authority, and economic life, somehow the majority of spiritual threats were women. The numbers make no sense unless you understand what the institution was really doing. Because while men accused of heresy were publicly broken on devices like the rack or the strapado, tools that left bones protruding and joints destroyed, women were funneled into something far more sinister: silent torture. This wasn't gentler, it was smarter. The techniques used on women were crafted around 3 core objectives. 1. Leave little to no visible evidence. Bruises that faded quickly, damage that lingered inside the body, trauma impossible to register on parchment. 2. Target reproductive organs. Pain was a superficial purpose. The deeper aim was control, of fertility, of desire, of the capacity to birth the next generation. And 3. Destroy credibility. Not just through confession, but by pushing women into states where their words sounded unreliable, hysterical, or sinful. And once you understand those objectives, everything else becomes clear. This wasn't about religion. It wasn't about doctrinal purity. It was about leveraging societal biases to control a population while keeping the institution spotless. So let's tackle the question that hides in the margins of every history book. Why women?
The answer isn't mystical, it's brutally practical. 3 motives drove the Inquisition to target them, but the first one, the economic motive, is the skeleton key that unlocks everything. To see it clearly, imagine yourself in Toledo in the late 15th century. Your husband, perhaps a skilled merchant or respected craftsman, dies. In a single stroke, you inherit his shops, his stored goods, his home, his land. Suddenly, you're an independent woman with resources. In a society where women rarely commanded wealth, you become highly visible and deeply vulnerable. Across thousands of cases, a pattern emerges. Around 40% of female accusations can be linked to property disputes, inheritance conflicts, or financial rivalries. This isn't theoretical. Spain's National Historical Archive is full of records showing a precise, chilling correlation between accusations and property seizures. Here's how it worked step by step. Step 1. A woman inherits wealth. Immediately she becomes a tempting target. Step 2. An anonymous accusation lands on the Inquisition's table. It could come from anyone, a frustrated business competitor, a resentful niece, or a neighbor angling for her home. No face attached, no proof required. Step 3. Arrest. Once the accusation was made, the burden of proof shifted entirely onto the woman. She had to prove her innocence, an almost impossible task. Step 4. Torture. Silent torture. Pain powerful enough to force a confession, but invisible enough to maintain the illusion of justice. Step 5. Confiscation. A tidy little revenue system followed. 1/3 of her property to the crown, 1/3 to the church, 1/3 to the Inquisition itself. Everyone benefited except the accused. Take the case of Maria Gonzalez, a wealthy widow from Toledo. Her alleged crime, secretly observing Jewish rituals, a charge known as Judaizing. The evidence? An unsigned letter. That's all it took. To break her, inquisitors employed a device called the spider. Imagine iron claws heated until glowed, then pressed to the breast, designed to mutilate tissue without leaving obvious marks on the skin. After 6 hours of agony, Maria Gonzalez confessed to everything they wanted. Demon meetings, Eucharistic desecration, teaching forbidden prayers. All fiction, but legally binding fiction. Within a week, her properties were seized. Her daughters lost their inheritance and their prospects. And the church, enriched with 3,000 ducats, emerged looking righteous, merciful, and justified. This wasn't a
If wealth put a target on women's backs, knowledge is what made that target glow. Here's a fact so staggering it reshapes everything you think you know. Around 60% of accusations against women weren't tied to heresy at all. They were connected to sexuality, midwifery, fertility, healing practices, or so-called love magic. Why? Because midwives and healers, women trusted to usher life into the world, held power that no priest, bishop, or tribunal could replicate. Picture the role of a medieval midwife. She advised families, treated illnesses, navigated complicated births, and cared for mothers afterward. Her training came from generations of women before her, not from the church. She often knew more about childbirth, herbal medicine, and reproductive care than any university-educated male physician. That independence alone made her a threat. And so, a new category of torture quietly emerged. Techniques not designed merely to extract confession, but to break the very organ systems that gave women their agency. These are not the devices you see in museums. These are the ones erased from polite historical memory. The vaginal pear. A metal bulb inserted into the body, then expanded by twisting a screw. It caused tearing, hemorrhaging, infections, and often permanent infertility. Its primary function wasn't confession, it was mutilation. The breast ripper. A clawed instrument, sometimes heated red, meant to tear flesh in ways that ruined the internal structures required for nursing. The outside healed, the inside didn't. Lower abdomen water torture. Women forced to consume massive amounts of water while pressure crushed their wombs and bladder. Internal ruptures were common. Visible bruising was rare.
These devices weren't improvisations. They were standardized and documented in manuals inquisitors used for training, most prominently in the Directorium Inquisitorium by Nicolau Aymeric. Section 14 details methods specifically engineered for women. This wasn't brutality on a whim. It was bureaucracy. One tragic story stands out. Isabel de la Cruz, a midwife in Guadalupe. When a noble woman experienced a stillbirth, Isabel was an easy scapegoat. The accusation? Packed with demons. After sessions with the vaginal pair, Isabel confessed to impossible crimes. Flying through the night, communing with devils, brewing lethal potions. She was burned alive. But the aftermath reveals the true cost. With Isabel gone and other midwives terrified into hiding, Guadalupe's maternal mortality rate tripled. Women died in childbirth, infants didn't survive their first week, and families whispered that God was punishing them, never realizing that the church had just eradicated the only group capable of saving them. Because the Inquisition wasn't just torturing individual women, it was dismantling entire systems of female knowledge, severing generational chains of medical wisdom that had existed for centuries. And yet, as brutal as the economic and bodily strategies were, but their tactic was even darker. Because after stripping wealth and destroying reproductive autonomy, the Inquisition found a way to break something far more permanent: a woman's voice. Something is coming that ties the entire system together, and once you see it, you'll never look at the Inquisition or modern power structures the same way again.
Up until now, we've moved through the physical landscape of the Inquisition, its confiscations, its secretive devices, its war on women's bodies and knowledge. But the next chapter of this story doesn't take place on the skin, it takes place in the mind. Because once the Inquisition perfected the art of invisible torture, tools that left minimal marks on the body, it discovered something even more potent: how to turn a woman's own voice into evidence against her. Not through force alone, but through engineered psychological collapse. This wasn't accidental. This was weaponized perception. Imagine the situation from an inquisitor's perspective. Visible injuries invite questions. Public displays of brutality create martyrs. But if you could break a woman so completely that the record shows only contradictions, confess, recant, confess again, you create a self-sustaining narrative. Women are unreliable. Women are liars. Women can't be trusted with testimony. And so the torture evolved. Not to dismantle bones, but to dismantle credibility. Let's explore the tools that made this possible. The tongue clamp. This device was clamped onto the tongue during trial procedures, sometimes hours before a woman entered the courtroom. It immobilized the tongue, crushed nerves, and often caused permanent slurring. When a victim finally stood before the judges, unable to articulate clearly, she came across as intoxicated, confused, or possessed. The inquisitors didn't need to say she was untrustworthy. The damage made the argument for them. The ducking stool. A deceptively simple contraption. A woman was tied to a wooden chair and repeatedly plunged underwater until unconsciousness loomed. No bruises, no scars, just terror. Afterward, she would often speak disjointedly, recounting hallucinations as if they were memories. The more she tried to explain the torture, the more erratic her testimony appeared. Sleep deprivation chambers. Some women were kept awake for 72 hours or more in pitch-black isolation. When they finally emerged, they stumbled into court delirious, paranoid, and sometimes unable to distinguish dreams from reality. It was the perfect formula to make a woman appear hysterical. And then there is Elvira del Campo, the woman whose story began our journey. Her case ties every thread of this system into a single devastating example. Elva was accused of a trivial offense, refusing pork. That alone was enough to raise suspicion of Jewish practices. When she denied the accusation, the inquisitors brought out two tools, the water method and the oral pear. 6 hours of drowning, mouth forced open until her jaw nearly dislocated. She confessed. Of course she confessed. But the next morning, she recanted. She said the confession was dragged out of her. Her refusal to maintain the confession gave the inquisitors everything they needed. They tortured her again, this time 8 hours. Another confession. And here's the twist. The trial record describes her second confession as given freely without coercion. It also mentions her initial denial as evidence of her unstable female nature. In other words, the torture wasn't merely a hidden mechanism, it became the foundation for a cultural stereotype. Elva's real voice had been erased. What remained was a legal document that portrayed her as erratic, unreliable, and morally compromised. Historians who finally accessed these archives centuries later noticed something even more chilling. The Inquisition disproportionately targeted educated women, women who owned books, women who could read Latin, women who knew enough about medicine, law, or ritual practices to challenge authority, women who might one day write down what had been done to them. These were not random victims, they were silenced scribes. The torture devices didn't just aim for pain or confession, they aimed to destroy the very faculties required to bear witness: speech, coherence, memory, sanity. Because the greatest threat to authoritarian systems has always been documentation. And when you fracture the mind, you fracture the record. Now, psychological torture is already horrific on its own, but the real devastation only becomes clear when we zoom out, when we stop looking at individual women and start looking at something much bigger: their descendants. In the 1990s, a team of Spanish historians undertook a project that no one had ever dared attempt. They traced the family trees of Inquisition victims forward, sometimes for 5 generations. What they found reshaped our understanding of how power operates across centuries. Women descended from Inquisition victims had dramatically lower literacy rates, marriage rates, and property ownership even 100 years later. Think about that. A single confession forced under torture in 1520 could shape a woman's life in 1620. This wasn't collateral damage, it was design. Here's how the mechanism unfolded. Step 1. Torture a woman until she collapses and confesses publicly. Step 2. Brand the entire family name as tainted. Step 3. Restrict who the daughters can marry. Step 4. Prevent them from inheriting property or joining respected institutions. Step 5. Ensure future sons and daughters remain on the margins, educationally, economically, and socially. Within 2 generations, the family line was effectively erased from influence. Within 3, it was integrated into poverty. By attacking individual women, the Inquisition disrupted entire genealogies. The psychological violence wasn't just personal, it was generational. And once you understand this, the last layer of the Inquisition strategy becomes horrifyingly clear. The real goal was not punishment, not deterrence, not purity of faith. The true goal was social engineering, a slow, invisible reprogramming of a population. And the Inquisition wasn't finished. There was one more tactic left, the most powerful of them all.
Confession under torture made mothers into heretics. Their daughters inherited the stigma, their granddaughters inherited the poverty.
The cycle perpetuated itself long after the torture chambers closed. Institutions understand this. They understand that credibility is generational. Lesson 4, documentation is both a weapon and a shield. The Inquisition kept immaculate records, not to reveal the truth, but to rewrite it. Pain became voluntary confession. Recantation became female instability. Torture became mercy through persuasion. But documentation also exposes patterns centuries later. Historians reading those same documents uncovered the scheme that Spain's rulers tried to bury. Because when violence is invisible, archives become battlefield evidence. So what does all of this mean for our world today? In quieter corners of the globe, in detention centers and interrogation rooms, in police stations and psychiatric facilities, women are still subjected to forms of coercion that leave minimal physical proof. Confessions appear voluntary. Testimonies appear contradictory. Institutions present themselves as benevolent. In some regions, female activists vanish into re-education programs. In others, reproductive autonomy is legislated away while the public is assured it's for safety or morality. In others still, women's economic independence is quietly undermined, not through fire and rack, but through bureaucracy, inheritance laws, or moral codes. The tactics evolve. The patterns don't. The Inquisition's genius wasn't in its brutality. It was in its invisibility. Its tortures left so few marks that for centuries, historians dismissed survivors' accounts as exaggerations or hysteria. Only recently have scholars begun to recognize how deliberate the strategy was, and how effectively it shaped Spanish society for generations. And here's the chilling truth. An invisible system is the hardest kind to fight. You can resist a tyrant you can see. You can protest a law written on paper. But how do you fight something woven into culture, into fear, into silence itself? This is the question we inherit from the women of the Inquisition. The women who couldn't write down what happened to them. The women whose voices were destroyed before they reached the courtroom. The women whose daughters carried their shame like a birthmark. But their stories didn't disappear. They survived in fragments. Court transcripts, personal letters, scattered testimonies written decades later. And together, these fragments form a warning that echoes into our century. The warning is simple. When violence hides, systems thrive. The Inquisition collapsed only when its mechanisms became visible. When journalists, philosophers, and European monarchies began to expose the torture, the financial motives, the corruption beneath its holiness. Public scrutiny weakened the illusion of righteousness. Once the mask cracked, the institution withered. And that brings us to the heart of the message. If invisible systems of control depend on secrecy, then our most powerful tool is exposure, documentation, witnessing, believing survivors, recognizing patterns instead of dismissing them as isolated incidents. The women destroyed by the Inquisition didn't have access to the platforms we do now. They couldn't record their torture. They couldn't publish their stories. They couldn't organize across borders. They couldn't preserve medical knowledge without risking death. But their suffering teaches us what to look for. It teaches us how systems disguise power as morality, how institutions weaponize documentation to rewrite truth, how violence passed down through generations doesn't need whips or chains. Sometimes it only needs silence. So before we close this chapter, consider this. Where in your world does violence leave no marks? Which institutions build reputations of righteousness while quietly destroying specific populations? Whose credibility is undermined through stereotypes designed generations ago? Which forms of knowledge, reproductive, medical, ancestral, are still being discredited or suppressed? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the fault lines along which invisible power still operates. And as long as these questions go unasked, the blueprint remains intact. But the moment they're spoken aloud, even whispered, the blueprint begins to crack. Because history isn't a closed book, it's a mirror.
and the patterns we fail to recognize are the ones most likely to repeat. Thank you for staying with the story until the end. And now, as promised, the journey doesn't stop here. Next time, we'll uncover the shadowed medical network that priests and kings couldn't extinguish, the medieval abortion underground, and the women who kept its secrets alive against impossible odds. They were healers, rebels, scientists, and outlaws.